In this episode, noise exposure and tinnitus or tinnitus, what years of loud sound can do to hearing. Long-term exposure to loud sound is one of the most commonly discussed factors linked to tinnitus. For many people, this includes years of music, nightlife, this was myself, or noisy work environments. Now in this episode, I'll talk about how repeated sound exposure can affect hearing over time, why symptoms don't always appear immediately, and how tinnitus can develop gradually. Now this is an educational discussion, not medical advice. Many people who experience tinnitus trace it back, at least in part, to long-term exposure to loud sound. That might be music, work environments, machinery, or repeated exposure over many years rather than a single event. In this episode, I want to talk about how noise exposure is commonly discussed in relation to tinnitus or tinnitus, why symptoms don't always appear straight away, and why tinnitus can sometimes develop gradually long after the sound exposure has happened. This is an educational discussion based on lived experience and reputable sources, not medical advice. And to say, one of the things that often surprises people is that tinnitus linked to noise exposure doesn't always start immediately after a loud event. Some people notice symptoms straight away, but many don't. Instead, tinnitus can develop slowly, sometimes months or even years later. This delay can make it difficult to connect the dots, especially if the exposure happened earlier in life and symptoms appear later on. To understand why this happens, it helps to think about how hearing works over time, rather than as an on-off system. Our hearing is constantly adapting to the environments we put it in. When sound levels are high, especially over long periods, the auditory system has to work harder to process that sound. Over time, this can place strain on the system, even if the changes aren't immediately noticeable. Noise exposure doesn't have to be extreme or painful or to matter. Repeated exposure to moderately loud environments, especially without recovery time, is often discussed as a contributing factor. This is why people who work in music, nightlife, construction, factories, or other noisy settings sometimes don't notice a problem until much later, when their listening environments become quieter and symptoms like tinnitus stand out. Another important point is that hearing damage isn't always obvious. Many people with tinnitus associated with noise exposure still pass standard hearing tests or feel their hearing is mostly normal. That's because hearing involves more than just detecting sound. It also involves how the brain interprets and processes those signals. Changes in that system don't always show up clearly on simple tests. Over time, repeated loud sound exposure can affect how the auditory system handles information. When external sound input is reduced later on, internal signals such as tinnitus can become more noticeable. This doesn't mean the sound exposure suddenly caused tinnitus at that moment. Instead, it's often the result of long-term changes that only become apparent under certain conditions. It's also worth mentioning that noise exposure doesn't affect everyone in the same way. Two people can be exposed to similar sound levels and have very different outcomes. Factors like genetics, overall health, or even stress levels and listening habits all play a role. This variability is one reason tinnitus experiences differ so much between individuals. Some people also assume that if tinnitus is related to noise exposure, it must mean severe or irreversible damage. While noise exposure is a recognised risk factor, tinnitus itself exists on a wide spectrum. For many people, symptoms fluctuate, change in intensity or become less intrusive over time as the brain adapts. Understanding this can help reduce some of the fear that often comes with the initial onset. Another common misconception is that only one loud event matters. In reality, cumulative exposure is often more relevant. Years of loud music, frequent gigs, clubs, rehearsals or noisy work environments can add up gradually. The auditory system doesn't always show immediate signs of strain, but the effects can build quietly in the background. This is one reason tinnitus linked to noise exposure is often described as something that crept in rather than arrived suddenly. People sometimes look back and realise they spent years in loud environments without giving much thought to hearing protection or recovery time. It's also important to separate tinnitus from the idea of constant deterioration. Noticing tinnitus doesn't automatically mean hearing will continue to worsen or that damage is actively occurring. Often what's changing is awareness rather than ongoing injury. The sound becomes more noticeable when tension shifts, environments change, or stress levels increase. Stress and fatigue can also interact with noise-related tinnitus. When the nervous system is under strain, perception can become sharper, making tinnitus feel more prominent even if the underlying signal hasn't changed. This interaction between sound exposure, stress and attention is just one reason tinnitus can feel unpredictable. Understanding the role of noise exposure doesn't mean dwelling on the past or assigning blame. Many people are simply unaware of the long-term effects of loud environments, especially in industries where high sound levels were normalised. What matters more is understanding why tinnitus behaves the way it does. For many people, gaining this understanding helps shift tinnitus from something mysterious and frightening to something that makes more sense within the context of their life and listening history. That shift alone can make tinnitus feel less intrusive over time. It's also worth remembering that tinnitus related to noise exposure is extremely common. You're not unusual for experiencing it, and your experience is shared by many others across different professions and backgrounds. In future episodes, I'll continue exploring related topics, including sound environments, listening habits, stress, sleep, and how people commonly describe changes in their tinnitus over time. All of these discussions are intended to be educational, calm, and grounded in real experiences rather than quick fix claims. Thanks for listening to this episode of the David Health Podcast. If you'd like to hear more educational discussions like this, you can subscribe for future episodes.